All right, it seems like the number of people joining has slowed down, so I think we will get started. Thanks for joining us this morning. Today we are talking about Iowa water quality standards and your role in the process. My name is Mike Schmidt. I am the General Counsel at the Iowa Environmental Council. I've worked on water quality and Clean Water Act implementation for more than 15 years, including 4 years at a state agency in Minnesota. For the last 6.5 years, I've been with the Iowa Environmental Council. IEC is the largest environmental coalition in the state. We work every day to collaborate with partners to create a just, healthy environment and a sustainable future for all Iowans. We do that through education, advocacy, and coalition building to create large-scale change. To accomplish our goals, we have program staff addressing water and land use, energy, climate, and other issues, but they all revolve around taking action at the federal, state, and local levels. The majority of our work is at the state level because we're a statewide organization. Today, I want to talk about what water quality standards are. Then I want to talk about those that are being considered by DNR. There's a public comment period open now. And so I want to also help folks understand what makes effective comments. Then we will have time at the end for questions and answers. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end. Starting off with water quality standards. The Clean Water Act goal is to clean up water across the country. States have delegated authority to set water quality standards to help do that. These water quality standards set goals and limit pollution in the water. EPA still has oversight and can recommend action for the states to take. States are supposed to adopt EPA's recommendations or explain why they are not doing what EPA recommends. As part of that delegated authority, states review water quality standards every 3 years, then submit their findings to EPA for review and approval. I'll walk through the 3 steps of water quality standards because this is helpful for understanding the process that DNR is undertaking right now. First, we identify how we want to be able to use the water. These are the designated uses. So each water body has different uses assigned that we want to protect. Those include things like recreation, aquatic life, drinking water, and those are then grouped into subclasses, so it might be warm water or cold water aquatic life. These uses include those that exist now and those that existed anytime in the last 50 years since 1975, as well as any that we think we can attain, those that we should be able to do, even if the water has not been clean enough to allow that in the last 50 years. The next step is to set criteria. This is what we often think of when we hear about water quality standards, but it's really just one piece of the larger water quality standard process. The criteria tell you what amount of pollution is allowed while still allowing that use that we want to protect. So it tells us the target that we are trying to hit. This is also the piece that if you're making public comments, you'll probably want to comment on. Criteria come in a couple of different forms. One is numeric, which is easier to measure against because it gives you a clear number to hit. But you have to do the science to identify what is the right number. Narrative standards are easier to set because you can just say, no nuisance aquatic life. But that is much harder to measure. When does the algae, for example, become a nuisance? Is just a little okay, or is a lot a problem? Where do you set that line? It's a little bit less clear. I want to note that setting criteria does not in itself solve the water quality problems. It does mean for permitted discharges, point sources like pipes from wastewater treatment facilities, the limits on those discharges depend on meeting the criteria. So for some types of discharges, like bacteria, the bacteria standard or criterion can be important for limiting bacteria coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. But setting criteria does not impose any restrictions on non-point sources. It does mean for some mechanisms like funding, it can be targeted to places not meeting standards, but it doesn't require anything. These also can give us a real sense of how we're doing. Are we meeting the criteria that we've set, or are we falling short? The third step is anti-degradation. The water quality standards and the Clean Water Act largely act like a one-way ratchet to gradually tighten down on pollution. Anti-degradation means if you have water that is meeting standards, you can't let the pollution exceed that standard. You also have to minimize any new pollution going into the water. You can think of it like a lake that might produce algae if it has too many nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. You want to keep the conditions below that level where more algae grows and the lake turns green. If you want to add any pollution to that lake, you can add a little bit, but you have to keep that below whatever the numeric criterion might be. We have different degrees of protection for different types of water bodies as well. We have some outstanding Iowa waters, mostly in Northeast Iowa and in the Okoboji area. They get more protection because we want to make sure that those special characteristics and the especially clean water stays clean. How are we doing on this? Well, we have a ways to go because, like I said, adopting standards doesn't necessarily fix our water quality problems. It does provide transparency and public awareness because we can measure, are we meeting the standards or not? And as you can see here, about 2/3 of rivers and streams, as well as lakes and reservoirs, are not meeting the standards that we've set. When that happens, then the water bodies are put on a list and called impaired because the uses that we are trying to protect are impaired. Then the state DNR calculates the maximum pollution load that would meet the standards. This is the total maximum daily load, or TMDL. Point sources then have limits based on that total maximum daily load put into their permits. Non-point sources like agricultural runoff and tile drainage are not limited by the total maximum daily load. So if we want to clean up our water and change this process, we need the public to understand the scale of the problem, and proper standards do that. Then we need some policy changes to make sure that the water is actually getting clean. I want to turn to what potential standards DNR is considering and what standards we think DNR should be considering. DNR held 2 hearings last month and provided a list of topics that it especially wanted comment on. Some topics have been more of a public concern. Some are driven more by DNR than by individual comments. And this 3-year review is seeking public input on what DNR should be working on for the next 3 years. So there are 2 components to that. What is on DNR's to-do list, and what order should that list of things be in? What do they work on first? I'll walk through the standards that we think are important for commenting on, then explain topics that DNR is considering for some other reasons. I want to start with human health criteria because it's pretty straightforward, and I think common sense that having cancer-causing chemicals in the water is bad. That's what the human health criteria protect against. EPA has scientists who just determine the safe levels based on research, and then EPA recommends those safe concentrations. States are supposed to adopt them unless they have some reason not to. The list of chemicals not adopted by Iowa includes things like PAHs, which are volatile hydrocarbons, solvents, petroleum derivatives, methyl mercury. There's a long list. It's possible that some of these are not generated in Iowa, so they are less of a problem. But as shown in the top table here, which is from DNR, we have not adopted these human health criteria for a majority of pollutants that EPA recommends protecting against. Those studies EPA uses to make those recommendations are based on mostly chronic conditions like cancer. So by not having these standards, we are not making sure that these are being limited in point source discharges and restricting the pollution that can cause cancer. The bottom table in this slide shows specific examples of chemicals. This is just the beginning of the list that EPA has, and it compares the EPA recommended criterion to what Iowa has on the books right now. These chemicals happen to be industrial solvents, which is why the names of the pollutants are a little long and confusing. But there are many other pollutants. There's about 125 on EPA's list, and Iowa DNR has not adopted standards for the majority of them. This is definitely one I encourage folks to comment on because we should clearly be minimizing the cancer-causing chemicals in our water. We have the second highest cancer rate, the fastest rising cancer rate. The least we should do is make sure that we have standards to limit what is getting into our water. Next, I want to talk about lake numeric criteria. This addresses things like phosphorus, nitrogen or nitrate, and algae. Right now, we have a narrative standard to limit nuisance aquatic life, which I mentioned earlier. That is a little bit hard to measure, and DNR has resorted to a translator to interpret that. So coming up with a number based on a combination of clarity and chlorophyll A to measure algae. If we want to be able to swim in our lakes and have our pets go in lakes, this is a good standard to advocate for. IEC and others have worked on this for many years, including DNR. In 2008, DNR came out with recommended numeric criteria, and IEC, with partners, petitioned twice to get the state to adopt that, but that did not happen. More recently, EPA made its own recommendations in 2021. These came out shortly after the last triennial review that DNR conducted. EPA's recommendations included specific recommendations for Iowa. They used Iowa as a case study and came up with what those numbers should be in Iowa. This issue is on DNR's list, and we encourage you to comment on it because Iowa is one of a number of states that have not acted on this, but many of our neighbors already have. It's feasible to come up with these numbers, to implement them, and so it's time for Iowa to do that too. We've had a number of lake advisories for algae over the past 20 years while DNR has been monitoring it. And so it's a big concern that pets can get sick and people can get sick from going in the water. A related concern, especially for lakes, but also for reservoirs, is a toxin produced by blue-green algae, also called microcystin, the algae is cyanobacteria, but called blue-green algae, and it produces this toxin, microcystin. Because not all algae produces this, you can't always tell whether an algae bloom is toxic, which makes it even riskier in some cases because people might think it's safe and then it isn't. If you go in this water that is usually kind of a pea soup looking water, it can make you sick, it can give you a rash, it can cause more serious problems if you ingest it, and it can also make your pets sick. DNR does a good job of monitoring and notifying folks about this with beach advisories, but we don't actually have a water quality standard or a criterion in place for this. This also creates risks for drinking water because conventional drinking water treatment doesn't remove this. The safe drinking water concentration, the amount in finished drinking water that's safe to consume, is less than 5% of the amount that's in the beach advisory level. So even if a beach doesn't have an advisory, if it's used for drinking water, it still could be a risk. So if you're concerned about swimming at beaches, your pets getting in the water, or drinking water sources, this is important to comment on. A related one is river nutrient criteria. We talked about setting those numeric standards for beaches. We also don't have those numeric standards for all rivers. Right now, what we do have is a criterion for drinking water, which is a limited number of stream segments because not all water is used as a drinking water source. And that drinking water criterion is 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate N. So that's the nitrogen component of nitrate. This was set to protect against short-term effects, blue baby syndrome, and that does not really address some of the issues with this in practice. We've seen this summer that the Raccoon River and Des Moines River both exceeded 10 milligrams per liter for a long time, and that created serious issues for water supplies in central Iowa. The Cedar River and Iowa River were also high, and that created problems in eastern Iowa. Because a lot of big water utilities pull from surface water, they don't always have alternative sources to go to. They might not have deep wells that have lower nitrate water. Because the existing criterion was only set to protect against short-term effects, it doesn't address long-term potential effects like cancer, thyroid disease, and birth defects. Research is increasingly showing that the 10 milligram per liter standard that we have in place is not enough to protect against those long-term effects. A related issue is that this does nothing to protect aquatic life. Some aquatic life is also affected by high concentrations of nitrate and the effects of nitrate. The drinking water standard we have doesn't address that in the least. Fortunately, Iowa DNR did develop draft river criteria for Iowa in 2013, but those were never adopted. Meanwhile, other states have been adopting these criteria, like the map I showed earlier. Minnesota has standards for rivers based on ecological region, including the Western Corn Belt Plains, which overlaps with Iowa. So we have a good foundation to move forward on river nutrient criteria. This will be important for protecting drinking water uses, especially in places that rely on rivers, as well as aquatic life. So we encourage you to comment on this as well. A little bit different issue is PFAS. These are also called forever chemicals, and they are used in things like water-resistant fabrics, cleaning products, and nonstick cookware. The manufacturers have voluntarily agreed to stop producing these because of the potential effects. They are tied to health impacts like developmental delays in children and infants, increased risk of cancer, and other health effects. Last year, EPA recommended criteria for 6 different PFAS components and a mixture of PFAS, but the new administration this year is backing off and recommending that only 2 of those 6 be adopted. Iowa right now has criteria for none of them. This can create problems because these pollutants get into drinking water sources based on things you might not expect. It can be things like firefighting foam or other sources that are not just part of the landscape. Another reason that these are concerning is that they create problems at the part per trillion scale, not parts per million like nitrate. So if we had 1 milligram or part per million of nitrate in our water, that would be progress from where we are now. But that would still be 1 million parts per trillion. And that is the scale that these chemicals can cause problems. So it is a much harder thing to measure and harder to control when you have problems at such small concentrations. We encourage folks to comment on this because this is one where there is a recommendation, we know there are health effects, and we don't have a standard in Iowa. I want to shift a little bit to a couple of other issues that DNR identified, but that may be a little bit harder or less important to comment on right now. The first is use attainability analyses. This is about that first step of the water quality standards process. How do we want to use the water? This process looks at individual segments and evaluates what are the uses that we want to protect. This is being driven more by DNR because state law requires an analysis of uses before reissuing permits. Right now, DNR has many overdue permits that have expired, and so the dischargers are continuing under their old existing permit, but DNR needs to do this analysis of the water that they discharge into before renewing the permit. It will be important to comment on these when DNR proposes changes to those individual water bodies because DNR might try to remove uses like swimming or fishing. And so the public needs to weigh in on whether the water has been or can be used for those things. Removing uses can also weaken the protections of anti-degradation, which leads to another issue that DNR raised. DNR is interested in making changes to the procedures intended to avoid and minimize degradation. I didn't get into it before, but in practice, minimizing degradation requires discharges to consider alternatives that might be less polluting. So if you propose to pollute 10 of something, but there's an alternative that means you only pollute 5 or even 7, you have to evaluate, could you reduce your pollution? Is there a cleaner alternative? IEC gets notices about these, and we regularly see notices about new chemicals with safety data sheets that talk about the different effects on aquatic life. Sometimes there might be a different chemical that would have a smaller effect and essentially be less risky for aquatic life or for some other use. If an alternative is too expensive, then the discharger might not have to do that, but it's kind of a balancing of what are the costs versus the benefits, which gets to the justification to degrade. Degradation is only allowed for important social or economic benefits. The justification for worsening water quality is basically you have to have a good reason. What we've seen is that the justification is often kind of generic or not tied to the action, which means you shouldn't actually be allowing degradation. There's also a risk that changes to the rules would add exemptions. That would mean poorer water quality because things don't have to minimize degradation. IEC, with our partners, is commenting on this with a focus on preventing weaker rules than we have now. But right now, DNR doesn't have specific proposals for changes. I want to turn to what we as the public can say to help inform and influence DNR's next steps. Once again, DNR is asking for two things. What standards should be on its to-do list, and what order should those be in? What should it prioritize? To be effective in making comments, it's helpful to be unique, fact-based, and succinct with your comment. So provide your personal perspective, provide your own information, have some specific requests, because we need DNR to know what you're asking for, not just generally clean water, and have a concise argument to support your points. In terms of making your comment unique and providing your perspective, personal impact and facts matter. You can talk about how water quality affects your behavior. Do you avoid going boating or kayaking? Do you not go to beaches? Do you not eat the fish you catch? This could also be about what you used to do in the water. If you grew up in Iowa and used to enjoy going to lakes, but now they have advisories, or what you wish you could do. If you're from outside of Iowa, you could also talk about where you moved from and how that compares to water quality in Iowa. I want to also note, if you have expertise on something, use it. For example, if you've done water quality testing, you can talk about what you found in your local stream. I encourage you to take a minute right now to think about what your personal experience is. Why do you care about water? What made you watch this today? So jot that down and think about what is important to you about water quality. I should point out, as someone who has worked on responding to public comments before, from the agency perspective, unique comments on the topic at hand require a response. Comments that are off topic are generally not considered, but comments that are on point and unique require the agency staff to think about how to address the comment. They also reflect greater public interest. And in your comment, you want to have a clear, specific ask of what you want to address. It's not enough to say, I want clean water. You need to ask DNR to do something about it. Do you want to reduce cancer risks? Do you want less algae at beaches? Keep that in mind as you're writing your comment. Then you want to tie that request and your personal facts or experience together. So make a concise argument to support your request. You could also highlight costs to your community or the state, things like tourism, maybe higher costs for drinking water treatment would be hard for you to afford. And if you have any facts about impacts to your local stream or beach, you could talk about that. I also encourage you to think about benefits that might be hard to quantify, things like lost opportunities, or quality of life. The things that we suggest commenting on include this list that I went through before. Right now, IEC has just finalized joint comments with 9 other nonprofit organizations, or maybe 8 other nonprofit organizations. So we encourage you to comment on the items that we've identified, and if you're concerned about other issues on DNR's agenda, feel free to raise those as well. The format of your comments can look something like this. Each of these bullet points could be a paragraph, or if you have more information, you can include more than that. I was copied on a comment letter recently that was 3 paragraphs long, but it made good arguments and brought up some history about nitrate that I didn't know about. So DNR will need to address that issue and that information that the comment provided. It doesn't have to be long to be effective. I also want to note that during the last triennial review, IEC and other groups did not emphasize public outreach. DNR only received 3 letters, one from IEC, one from the Farm Bureau, and one from the Iowa corn growers. We would love to have DNR see that the public is very engaged on this and that people really care about addressing our water quality problems. We want the state and EPA to understand that we can't wait any longer for action to address the problems we see. Once you've submitted your comments by Monday at 4:30, DNR will respond to the comments and develop a work plan for what to do over the next 3 years. DNR then submits that to EPA, which must approve or disapprove it. Presumably, the federal government will reopen and EPA staff will come back so they can review that state submission. DNR then undertakes the adoption of the standards that are proposed in that work plan. And if EPA disapproves of something, EPA must develop its own standard. So there is an obligation for action if EPA doesn't approve what DNR proposes. Once that happens, DNR will be going through the rulemaking process for whatever changes to water quality standards it's going through, and all those will be subject to EPA approval as well. With that, I am happy to take questions. Thank you for your time. All right, I do see that we have some questions here. So one question is about how to advocate for DNR to adopt standards for chemicals. Letters or emails are the best way. DNR on the public notice did allow mailing to its office, 6200 Park Avenue in Des Moines. I think emails are probably easier, and at this point, probably a safer bet unless you're mailing it today. So I encourage folks to email wqs@dnr.iowa.gov. We also have a question about rowing on the Des Moines River and Easter Lake. So what can folks in Iowa do to clean up our lakes and rivers? This is great. There are lots of cleanup opportunities where you can go out and clean up trash, kind of the big visible trash. There are groups that do that annually. And so I encourage you to find the groups that do that. IEC does not organize that kind of on the ground cleanup, but there are lots of local groups that do that. And that is a good first step. I also encourage joining groups that do water quality testing, like Polk County Conservation or the Isaac Walton League. They have Nitrate Watch at the Isaac Walton League to measure nitrate concentrations around the state, and that's a great way to get engaged. There's another question about why PFAS are more concentrated in the Cedar Rapids area than in Des Moines. That depends on the individual sources of PFAS. So it depends on what industries were using solvents or other things containing PFAS. And there are concerns in Des Moines for PFAS, but it is distributed around the state. There are some places, including I think it's Comanche on the Mississippi River on the east side of the state, that are actually getting funding from 3M, a PFAS manufacturer, for treatment of their drinking water system, or a different way to get clean water. There's also a question about talking more specifically about the reasoning behind the justification to degrade. So under federal regulations, degradation is only allowed if there would be important social or economic benefits. We've reviewed a number of anti-degradation alternatives analyses that look at those alternatives to identify what would be least degrading, but still affordable and feasible. And those include a justification for the degradation. The justification needs to essentially say, we need to be able to do this for these benefits. What we've seen, instead of saying, here are the benefits of whatever the change is or whatever the increased degradation is, we've seen people say, well, the overall community is lower income than the state as a whole, so any increased cost would be a problem. But there's no explanation for why the increased cost would affect the community. So there should be some more detailed justification for this change and what effect this change would have. I don't know if that is as much detail as you'd want, but hopefully that is at least a little bit clearer. We do plan to share slides. Somebody asked if we could reference or post the slides to be able to reference those rather than having the full recording. I'm sure we can do that. I will talk with our other staff about that. Another question is about EPA rescinding impaired waters at the behest of industrial ag in Iowa. What happens if big ag does an end run again and gets EPA to disapprove? The EPA impaired waters rescission action from July of this year was about nitrate impairments on several river segments. They changed course after outreach and an email from DNR. DNR interprets the nitrate standard that we have as a chronic standard, even though the effects tend to be short-term effects like blue baby syndrome. And EPA decided to, I guess, agree with DNR and consider more information. It's a little unclear exactly what the position of EPA is, because it both rescinded and is considering more information. We actually sent a letter about that, and there's an article in Iowa Capital Dispatch about that today, so I encourage you to take a look at that. In terms of what is going on with this and EPA's review and approval, so the review and approval by EPA is an agency action that could be subject to challenge. And we also want to make clear to Iowa DNR that people really want action on the standards that we are commenting on. IEC has commented on some of these issues like lake numeric nutrient criteria for years, and DNR has not moved ahead with those. So hopefully with more public input and public interest, we can demonstrate to DNR and to EPA that it is finally time for action here. Another comment is about getting assistance to write a letter about water quality. And we are happy to help folks. I'm happy to answer questions that folks might have. So if you want help with something, feel free to reach out and we can see what we can do. There are some things that we tend not to get involved in. We don't get involved in every local issue because we just don't have capacity for that. But especially for statewide issues like this, And some individual actions we do engage where we think it makes sense. We also got a question about what role local governments like counties could play in advancing water quality that's not happening. There are a couple of things that I would recommend. One is making sure that any lakes where people recreate are measured. We know that DNR measures state parks and beaches where people recreate, and some counties do that, but not all. We have heard about health problems from lakes that either were not measured or were not being widely reported just this past summer. And so making sure that all of those lakes are monitored is one important first step. There are also actions that counties can take to make sure that new development is managing stormwater properly and holding back water as much as possible. There are some limitations in state law on that, but to the extent you can, that can be helpful. And then making sure that the county conservation board and soil and water conservation districts are doing as much as they can is also a county function. There's also a question about reestablishing the Iowa Water Volunteer Monitoring Program. This is an old program that was using volunteers to monitor water around the state. In some ways, this has been recreated with the Isaac Walton League Nitrate Watch and things like the Polk County Conservation Monitoring Program. I don't think it would be bad at all to have a statewide formalized program. I think it is unlikely, given that we are having trouble making sure that we fund monitoring as it is already. We also have a question about if my concern is essentially cancer risk and nitrate, is this enough upon which to submit a comment? Is just seeing the Iowa River enough? I would say you should articulate your concerns, and we also are posting our public comments online, and so I encourage you to take a look at that and see if that gives you any additional ideas about what your concerns are, and you can talk about why you think it is a risk to your health. If you live in an area along the Iowa River, you could also talk about what you're seeing there, whether it is visual pollution or other concerns. And so, yeah, I encourage you to bring up whatever personal experience you have, and then look at the comments that we worked on if you want some more technical information. We also have a question. Did I understand correctly that Iowa has not adopted EPA standards for known carcinogens in water? Short answer is yes. EPA updated its recommendations in 2015 for those human health criteria based on long-term chronic health effects, including cancer. Iowa has not adopted those updates. So Iowa is relying on EPA's 2002 recommendations. So those are more than 20 years old now. And in the last 10 years, Iowa DNR has not updated the Iowa standards to address the rest of those. We have a couple of comments about cleanup efforts to respond to that earlier question about what people can do. In the Des Moines area, Urban Ambassadors helps organize cleanup events. They also do tree plantings and lots of other things that ultimately benefit water quality in the environment. Project Aware has an annual river cleanup. And so you can canoe around and take out a lot of trash. They've taken out huge amounts of trash over the past couple decades. And it's a great event to get to know other folks in Iowa and get more involved. We have a question about Backbone Lake being polluted since it was dredged and supposedly fixed by DNR. And so the commenter and their kids can't swim there. This is not the only place where this has been a problem. Lake Darling was also renovated by DNR through a restoration process more than 10 years ago. And this year it was one of the highest for beach advisories, both for microcystin and for E. coli. The problem with the dredging and restoration is that if you still have the pollution upstream going into the lake, then you will still have problems. We need to fix problems not just in the lakes, but also in the watershed going to the lake. So I encourage you to comment on that. We have a question if you already submitted a comment to DNR, for example, using the action alert that IEC or others have used. I know more than 500 people have already submitted comments so far this year. So we're way past the last round that only had 3 comments. But if you have other things to say, you can certainly send another comment before the 20th. And so I encourage you to think about the issues that I talked about today and the format that I talked about today. And you're welcome to submit another comment before Monday at 4:30. We have a question about resistance to improving water quality and where that comes from, whether it's the DNR, the legislature, the Farm Bureau. It kind of varies. It depends on the particular issue and the process. I think generally most farmers in the state are operating in a system that incentivizes them to produce corn and soybeans, and corn in particular tends to leak a lot of nitrate. We also have a lot of concentrated animal feeding operations in Iowa, and those produce a lot of manure. The largest fraction of nitrate in the state or in the Polk County area, based on the Central Iowa Source Water Resource Assessment, found that manure was the biggest chunk of the nitrogen going through the rivers in Polk County. So I think there is some resistance to changing processes that are contributing to pollution in Iowa, but not all the pollution is from those sources. We also have those solvents, industrial chemicals, things like that. And so there's resistance sometimes to addressing those issues, even though for some industries like PFAS, manufacturers have voluntarily agreed to stop producing it. That's not true for things like nitrogen and manure, where the agricultural industry depends on that and needs that, and we just need a better system to manage it. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's kind of how I think of the problems and how we need to address them. Another person asks, how can I best say that the narrative criteria is simply not working? Are there clear examples I can use? I think one thing to point to is the number of beach advisories in the state. We've had more than 300 beach advisories or weeks of beach advisories on different beaches over the past couple decades. And so highlighting those is one angle that you could take. You could also comment on whatever waters you go to that are polluted, and so you can point to those and say, I would like to be able to go to this lake, or I'm concerned about whatever else you're concerned about, and say what we have now is clearly inadequate. We need a different approach. Another question is, why can't the state or county buy back farmland to create buffers? I think it could, but it would need to allocate money for that. IEC and other groups, including conservation districts of Iowa in the past, have recommended requiring buffers. Minnesota does this, and they achieved more than 99% compliance in just a couple of years. And they did that with state money supporting easements on a lot of that land, and federal money also doing that as well. So that is an approach that I think would be beneficial in a lot of ways. It would not necessarily address all of our problems, because especially where we have tile drainage, that will bypass any buffers along the stream unless you have a saturated buffer. But it would be helpful for reducing erosion along rivers and soil loss. Another question is, where would human health criteria apply? And that this is mostly a designated use for fish consumption. Yeah, there are two types of human health criteria. One is for just in water, and another is for water plus fish consumption. And so, so there are some that are more focused on fish and others that aren't. But there are lots of places where people are fishing, and so we need to be cautious about how much fish we eat if the fish might be contaminated with these kinds of pollutants. So yeah, not every water has the human health criteria designation or use protection, but it is definitely one that we want to make sure we have all of the criteria that we should have where people are consuming fish. Another question is whether Iowa's water quality is likely to be an issue in the next legislative session or the 2026 elections. IEC is a 501c3 nonprofit, so we are not engaged in campaigns or elections. But I think it is definitely more in the public consciousness that we need to do more to address our water quality problems. And a lot of those actions need to be done at the state level. Counties are limited in what they can do, as are cities. I don't think the federal government is likely to address this anytime soon. And one of our biggest problems in the state is non-point sources, and those are essentially left to the states under the Clean Water Act. So yes, I think we do need some more action on this at the state level to address the problems we have. One thing we need to do initially is to make sure that we continue to have monitoring so that we can identify how severe the problems are and what needs to be done. Another question is, are you aware of other states with water quality that's bad? Are we the worst of all states? I don't know. I've only worked in 2 states, so I know there are other places with nitrogen or nitrate issues, just like we have here. I think it might be more widespread than here, but there are lots of other states with similar issues based on nitrate, and other states with other pretty serious issues based on industrial pollution or other sources. So it's a little bit hard to make an apples to apples comparison when you're talking about different pollutants and pretty different circumstances. So I don't have a clear answer to that. Another comment here is that endocrine disruptors are an unaddressed issue. Yes, there's a whole universe of emerging issues that can be a problem for human health, and a lot of those don't have standards or recommended standards at this point because EPA is still looking at the science and doesn't have recommended criteria at this point. I think those are all the questions I see right now. So thank you again for joining. Thank you for your questions, and feel free to let us know if you have questions about your comments, and I encourage you to take a look at our comments as well. Thank you.